Timothy and Kathleen Carroll were at one point seen as saints. They took in children with serious health conditions and disabilities with the goal of giving them a good life. That all changed, however, when the children started dying, some of which under mysterious circumstances. Were the Carrolls murderers, or did they just experience a tragic series of unavoidable events? Let's investigate. If you enjoy mysteries, true crime, disappearances and conspiracies, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. I also have a Patreon and a PayPal, so if you're interested in supporting the channel, I'll leave links for those in the description. I first heard about this case on the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, so thanks to user Dreams and Chains for their post, which was very useful when writing up the notes for this video. Timothy and Kathleen, we'll call them Tim and Kath, were a married fundamentalist Christian couple. Kath had previously worked in nursing homes and hospitals, but at some point stopped working and was living off Tim's social security checks, which he received due to his disability. Some sources say he was a paraplegic, so in a wheelchair, but others say he can walk with the aid of 2 canes. The couple couldn't have their own biological children, and eventually decided it was God's will for them to adopt children and bring them up in a religious household, homeschooling them. There isn't as much information online about this story as you'd expect, and the sources I found gave slightly different dates and other details, so apologies if any of the exact dates or ages are wrong. I just tried to either go by the most reputable source or the detail that was cited by the most sources. The ages in particular were hard to work out, as most sources are not clear whether the ages given for the children were correct at the time of the adoptions, or at the time of writing, or at the time of the incidents occurring, so apologies if it gets a bit confusing. The Carrolls began adopting in 1984 and were willing to take in children that struggled to get adopted, such as children with severe disabilities and older siblings. They were prided on their dedication to these children and were given high praise on their home study reports. Kath somehow managed to obtain one of these confidential reports which spoke highly of the couple and sent them to various agencies, stating that she wanted to adopt 5 to 7 more children and would travel anywhere to get them. They adopted Anne-Marie, who was around 11 years old at the time, and her brother, James, who was around 10. In 1991, a few days before her 18th birthday, Anne-Marie attempted to burn down the family home and was subsequently placed in the custody of the Ohio Department of Youth Services. Tim and Kath told police that she was extremely emotionally disturbed and that they believed that this arson attempt was her attempt to kill them. Anne-Marie disputed that and claimed it was her way of calling attention to the problems in the home and kind of a cry for help in a way. Though because records show that she had behavioural problems prior to moving in with the Carrolls, their story was believed. After this, the Carrolls moved around a little before settling in a 5-bedroom home on 5 acres of cleared out land in Cedarville, Ohio in 1992. By this point, they had adopted 8 more children. Hosea was 9 years old and had a difficult upbringing and behavioural problems, but no severe disabilities. Josiah was 12 and had cerebral palsy and asthma. 11-year-old Isaiah suffered from brain damage that left him non-verbal and in a wheelchair. 6-year-old Hannah and 5-year-old Samuel both had Down syndrome. Noah was 3 years old and prone to seizures. He was born with brain damage due to his mother taking drugs while she was pregnant with him. 3-year-old Molly had several severe allergies as well as mental impairments from a rare genetic disorder called Cry-du-Chat syndrome. Chloe was just 3 weeks old when the Carrolls took her in and was born with a rare condition known as anencephaly, meaning there was only a brain stem in her skull. Tim and Kath spent $6,000 to bring Chloe home and were in the process of finalising the adoption when the mysterious deaths began. On the 21st of September 1992, Hannah, the 6-year-old girl with Down syndrome who was also legally blind, was found unresponsive by the family. 3 days prior, 17-year-old James was babysitting the children while Tim and Kath were out. He claimed that Hannah had attempted to climb up a 5-foot-high shelf and pulled off a bottle of bleach, which then spilled on her. Tim and Kath treated the wounds themselves rather than seeking medical help until she was found unresponsive. A paramedic noted that Hannah had visible chemical burns over a large part of her body, despite Tim and Kath claiming that the wounds were healing nicely, which the family doctor later disputed and claimed that she would have been in a lot of pain. I don't want this to be too graphic, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on what the autopsy said. You can find that information online if you want to, but the coroner stated that the severity of Hannah's burns indicated that she had been immersed in bleach for an extended period of time, possibly around an hour. Burns on her arms were also consistent with her attempting to defend herself as bleach was poured on her from above. It was also determined that she likely hadn't eaten for 24 hours, and a mark was found on her leg which could have been a cigarette burn. Hannah's injuries were life-threatening, but she could have been saved if she had been taken to the hospital as soon as it happened. While it would be no good excuse, it makes sense that the Carrolls might not have taken Hannah to the hospital because of their religious views, though the family doctor later stated that none of their strong religious views would prevent them from seeking medical attention, so it's anyone's guess why they didn't. For what it's worth, the doctor and a neighbour said that they found it hard to believe that Hannah's death was anything but an accident. But police filed charges against the Carrolls for involuntary manslaughter, though the other children remained in their custody apart from Chloe. Because the adoption hadn't yet been finalised, the private agency demanded her return. Sadly, within days of her return to the agency, and at only 7 weeks old, she died on the 19th of October 1992. Police have never publicly stated whether or not Chloe's death was suspicious, and it's unknown if her death was as a result of her treatment at the Carroll home or unrelated. Less than a month later, on the 15th of November 1992, police were called after 3-year-old Noah, the boy with brain damage who was prone to seizures, was found dead in the home. Tim and Kath said that they thought he died during a seizure, and the medical examiner agreed that Noah appeared to have died of natural causes after performing an autopsy. However, police noted that when they arrived at the home, Noah's body felt cold, suggesting he'd been dead for a few hours, which is a bit suspicious. 3 weeks later, 3-year-old Molly, who had severe mental impairments, cry-do-chat syndrome, and many allergies, was found dead in her bed. Similar to Noah, her body was cold when responders arrived at the house, and paramedics estimated that she had been dead for around 12 hours. Apparently it wasn't unusual for Molly to sleep for around 12 hours, which kind of explains why no one knew why she was dead for so long, but surely it would make sense to check on her at some point within those 12 hours, and that's also assuming that she died around the time that she went to sleep. The autopsy was inconclusive. It was possible that she could have been suffocated, but it couldn't be ruled out that she died naturally as a result of her health conditions, which put her at higher risk of early death. Despite no concrete evidence of foul play, police were getting pretty suspicious at this point, simply because 4 children had now died within 3 months. They wondered why the Carrolls didn't call an ambulance for Molly sooner. How could they leave a 3-year-old child with serious health conditions unattended for that length of time? Due to these suspicions, the remaining children were temporarily removed from the Carroll home, though they all returned later, just 2 days before Christmas, because there was no evidence that Tim and Kath had caused the death of the children. After being charged with involuntary manslaughter charges after Hannah's death, Tim and Kath both pled guilty to child neglect charges in 1992 and admitted that they should have taken Hannah to the hospital straight after the bleach incident. They were sentenced to 5 years probation and agreed to not adopt any more children without prior court consent. In June 1993, Josiah, the 12-year-old boy with cerebral palsy, was found dead in his bed. Just like Noah and Molly, his body felt cold and it's thought he died several hours before an ambulance was called. Police again requested emergency custody of the remaining children, but it was again denied. A month later, an inquest was opened which highlighted inconsistencies between experts' testimony and the Carrolls' stories about the deaths. Charges were filed against 17-year-old James for delinquency by reason of involuntary manslaughter because he was supervising Hannah at the time of the bleach incident. As Tim and Kath have maintained since it happened, James claimed it was an accident. The judge ordered for 11-year-old Isaiah, who was non-verbal and in a wheelchair, and 5-year-old Samuel, who had Down syndrome, to be removed from the home pending the result of the investigation into James, but allowed James and Hosea to remain with Tim and Kath. In October 1993, Molly and Josiah's bodies were exhumed against the Carrolls' wishes. Second autopsies revealed nothing new, no concrete evidence of foul play, though smothering or suffocation couldn't be ruled out. Sometime later, a coroner declared Josiah's death to be a suspected homicide, though no charges were ever filed in relation to his death or Hannah's, which was also determined to be a homicide. In November, James was acquitted of all charges, and Tim and Kath requested that the state return Isaiah and Samuel to the home. This was denied, though they were granted visitation rights. Not long after, Samuel was taken to hospital unconscious after fainting in the Carroll home. Thankfully, he recovered and was discharged later that day. In May 1995, Tim and Kath regained custody of Isaiah and Samuel on the condition that they send the children to public school and also follow all advice from their doctors. The Carrolls stuck to this for some time before taking legal action to overturn the decision, which they succeeded in and were again granted the right to homeschool their children in October 1997. And that was basically when the investigations ended. Despite two of the children's deaths thought to be homicides, the Carrolls have always maintained their innocence. Kath has since said, quote, "You have to look at the whole picture. The children weren't supposed to live as long as they did. We, by having the children that we have, put ourselves in a very high-risk group for having something like that happen. They hand you your baby and they say, here's your baby, we don't know why you want this child, we're glad you're taking it, because we don't know what to do with it, but it's going to die. It's not that you don't accept it or you don't believe them, it's just that you go home and you live your life with your baby and every day is a gift from God." Tim and Kath continued caring for Isaiah until he died in 2018 at the age of 35 years old, and it appears that they still care for Samuel to this day. I couldn't find any information on what happened to James, but Hosea now has a family of his own and seems to look back fondly on his childhood. So were the deaths accidental, or as a result of natural causes, or was there a more sinister explanation? First, let's consider the possibility that the children died of natural causes. As Kath said, most of the children that they took in had pretty serious health conditions which put them at higher risk of complications. Obviously, I'm not a doctor, but I attempted to do a little bit of research on the conditions that the children had to see how plausible it is that they really did die of natural causes. Chloe, the baby with anencephaly, wasn't in the care of the Carrolls at the time of her death, though it couldn't be ruled out that she died as a result of her treatment prior to leaving the home. She actually lived longer than expected for a baby with that condition though. Sadly, almost all die very soon after birth. 3-year-old Noah supposedly died during a seizure, and while deaths as a result of a seizure are relatively rare, it certainly can happen. Though remember, we're only taking the Carrolls' word for it that he actually died while having a seizure. Molly, who had cry-du-chat syndrome, as well as severe allergies and other impairments, could well have died of natural causes, it's hard to say. Studies show that the mortality rate for cry-du-chat syndrome is about 10%. 75% of deaths occur within 3 months of birth, and 90% occur within the first year. According to Wikipedia, once a child has survived the first few years of life, the prognosis is good and the mortality level is low. I'm not sure what exactly is meant by first few years, but it does sound like Molly's risk of dying would be much less at 3 years old. It's hard to determine whether she died as a result of an allergic reaction. According to the results of a study on deaths caused by an allergic reaction, 23 of 56 autopsies showed no indications of an allergic death, so it's no surprise that Molly's cause of death was inconclusive. It's unlikely that Josiah's death was caused by cerebral palsy. It isn't a life-threatening condition unless accompanied by other serious health problems. He also had asthma, which can kill people. According to asthma.org.uk, 3 people die every day from asthma attacks, though it's thought that 2 out of 3 of those deaths could have been prevented with better routine care. Asthma may have caused or contributed to Josiah's death, but surely a coroner retroactively ruled his death a suspected homicide for a reason. Maybe there are details not publicly known. So there's a chance some of the deaths could have been due to natural causes or an accident in the case of Hannah, but in Hannah's case I think that's the least likely explanation. In all likelihood, Chloe's death probably was as a result of natural causes, but the others can't be determined for sure. It's possible the deaths were down to neglect as opposed to intentional homicide, in which case Tim and Kath are still 100% responsible, but maybe they didn't actually mean for the children to die, they just couldn't take care of them properly. Maybe that was simply because they'd bitten off more than they could chew. Taking care of 1 or 2 children with those kind of health conditions would take a lot of time and dedication, so it's hard to really imagine a scenario where a couple, one of whom is disabled themselves, could give 10 children the care that they needed. Considering after 3 of the deaths, it was noted that the children had been dead for some time before an ambulance had been called, it stands to reason that they weren't checked on as often as they should have been. And Anne-Marie, the girl who was removed from the family home after attempting to set fire to it, claimed that she and her brother James spent most of their time taking care of the younger children. She described it as an oppressive life, though James disputed this and claimed that he was loved and cared for by the Carrolls. We do know that James was looking after Hannah and some of the other children when the bleach incident occurred though, and I doubt that was the only time that he had to take care of the children. Hosea appears to look back on his childhood fondly though, and never implied that he was neglected or that any of the other kids were neglected either. James and Hosea both actively wanted to return to the home after they were removed following Molly's death. Up until Hannah's death, the children were all given the basic medical attention that they needed, though some doctors and therapists noted that the Carrolls missed multiple appointments. Kath claims there was always a reason for every missed appointment. Besides the deaths, there was never any obvious signs of neglect though. The investigations found nothing, and each time the Carrolls adopted a new child, they had to go through a 6-month home study. The home was described as clean and tidy, and there was never any indication that the children weren't being properly looked after. In fact, they prided themselves on pushing the children to achieve what they were told was unachievable. For example, they were told that Molly would never cry or laugh or even recognise anyone, and when they first adopted her, she didn't even want to be touched by anyone. But after some time with the Carrolls, she started laughing and smiling, even though she was only able to crawl. The next theory we'll look at is that Tim and Kath intentionally murdered their children. As we've already discussed, it's not impossible that some of the deaths were as a result of natural causes, but even taking that into consideration, 5 children dying in 9 months is a lot. It's Hannah's death that is the most suspicious though. The story is just so hard to believe. She reportedly had the skill level of a 9-month-old, so how likely is it that she went through 2 doors, climbed up on a shelf, got a bottle of bleach and unscrewed the lid before pouring it on herself? The only situation I can think of to explain this is a hard to believe one. Maybe there was no lid on the bleach for some reason and she somehow managed to climb up onto the shelf and just knocked it off as she fell onto the ground, so the bleach was pouring on her while she was on the floor. Maybe that could explain the marks on her arm. It could have just been her trying to avoid the bleach going into her eyes. But that certainly doesn't explain everything, especially the fact that it appeared that she had been immersed in bleach for around an hour, despite James claiming that he put her straight in the shower. And it just doesn't make sense that they wouldn't get her immediate medical attention. They claimed that the wounds were healing nicely and that she was acting relatively normal, though this was disputed by doctors who claimed that she would have been in a lot of pain. But if some of the deaths were murders, what would be the motive? It certainly wasn't for financial gain. The funerals were all paid for out of the Carrolls' own pockets, there were no life insurance policies for any of the children, and there was no financial motive for adopting to begin with, considering the Carrolls actually lost money adopting some of the children. They had to cover the costs of some of the medical bills themselves and spent $6,000 bringing Chloe home. They were actually eligible for a lot more support than they received, financial and otherwise, but they chose not to take it. I have no idea why they do that. They claimed that they just wanted more children to love and that they didn't want any more freebies, but if the support they were offered could help them take better care of the children, why not take it? Were they just trying to prove a point or what? Maybe they underestimated how much care the children would need and realised that they were in too deep, but didn't want to admit that they were struggling, so just decided to kill some of the children off. That doesn't really make sense either though, considering they always wanted more children and were prepared to go to great lengths to get them. If they did murder any of the children, it's possible that they saw it as some kind of mercy killing. For example, if they saw that the children were in a lot of pain and they just thought that killing them would send them to God or whatever. Or maybe this was some kind of Munchausen by proxy situation, it's really hard to say. But it's important to remember that charges were only ever filed in Hannah's death, where it was determined that Tim and Kath should have sought medical attention, but they were never actually charged of murder. And it seems that some of the deaths, especially Chloe's, were probably as a result of natural causes. Another possibility is that James was actually the murderer. He was in charge when the bleach incident occurred, and there was no evidence to suggest that Tim or Kath were home at the time. He was acquitted of all charges, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he was innocent, just that they didn't have any evidence to prove that he was guilty. Interestingly, it was James that called 911 after Molly died. I'm not sure whether he actually found the body, but he definitely made the call. He did find Josiah's body though. Apparently Josiah went to bed at around 6:30 to 7 PM, and James went to check on him around 10 PM and found him dead in his bed. I'm not sure if he was present for Noah's death, but he was at least around at the time of 3 out of 5 of the deaths. In 1994, prosecutors claimed that Isaiah had communicated to them that he'd been a victim of assault by James and that he'd witnessed James smothering another child. Isaiah was non-verbal, but apparently indicated what he saw by answering yes or no questions. Tim and Kath claimed Isaiah was too low functioning to have communicated that, and no charges were filed as he was unable to answer the questions again when asked by the court. It's possible that Tim and Kath were naive and just didn't connect the dots, or somehow didn't realise that James might have been responsible, or maybe they even covered for him. You might wonder why they do that, especially when they sent Anne-Marie away for trying to burn the house down, but it was pointed out in one of the comments on the Reddit post that gender might have been a factor. It's interesting that out of 3 girls adopted by the Carrolls, 2 of them died and 1 of them was sent away. I'm not hugely familiar with the lifestyle of a fundamentalist Christian, but research tells me that they're quite traditional. It's plausible that Anne-Marie was treated differently to her brother and to the other male children, and that most of the childcare was pushed onto her just because she was the oldest girl. Hence she claims to have had an oppressive life there. The deaths only started after she moved out, which could suggest that she did her best to look after the kids, but once she moved out, the neglect got worse, with James being the sole caregiver while Tim and Kath were away. It's been suggested that James might have been the golden child. If he wasn't the cause of any of the abuse or neglect, maybe he was at least aware of it but just didn't say anything because it didn't happen to him. Or if James did murder some of the children, maybe Tim and Kath covered for him on the condition that he painted a happy picture of life in the home. I personally think it's pretty likely that James murdered Hannah and possibly even some of the other children, seeing as he was always there when they died. I don't know if Tim and Kath knew and covered for him, or were naive and didn't realise, or just didn't want to believe it because he was the golden child. I do wonder if Tim and Kath were more focused on their religious mission than actually taking proper care of the children though. I'm not even necessarily saying they were intentionally neglectful. I mean, they could have been, but even without intention, taking care of so many children with such serious health conditions is no easy task. And they probably did push a lot of the childcare onto Anne-Marie and then James when she left. Maybe James wanted less responsibility and started killing the children to take some of the load off, or maybe he killed them during a fit of rage or punishment gone wrong, who knows. I don't think there's really anything suspicious about Chloe's death, considering she was lucky to survive as long as she did with her condition. But who knows, just because she did have that condition doesn't mean that something couldn't have happened to her which might have killed her anyway. And perhaps one or more of the other deaths were due to natural causes, but I just find it so hard to believe that Hannah's death was anything but a murder. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you agree with my theory that James might have done it, or do you have another theory? If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Huge thank you to my patrons, whose names are on screen now. I really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday in a new video.